Here's quite a story for you. A new report suggesting that Russia may have used expensive art as a bribe in its successful bid to host the 2018 World Cup. The Sunday Times newspaper says a Picasso was given to FIFA executive member Michel Platini.
Platini calls those allegations total fabrications. The report also says Vladimir Putin, Russian Prime Minister at the time, took a personal interest in helping his country win the bid.
Now, these allegations all come at a already troubling time, of course, for Mr. Putin. He has a lot on his plate. The fall in oil prices sending the ruble tumbling just a day after huge demonstrations in Moscow.
Yeah, that's right. Thousands turned out to protest controversial healthcare reforms. One demonstrator carried a picture of Mr. Putin with a message that read, "When will your dirty tricks end?"
And Monday, during a visit to Turkey, Mr. Putin cancelled plans for a major gas pipeline to southern Europe. He accuses European officials of putting up obstacles to the so-called South Stream project. Others see it differently.
We spoke a short time ago with Peter Baker, a former Moscow bureau chief for the Washington Post and co-author of Kremlin Rising. He's now the chief White House correspondent for the New York Times.
Yeah, we asked whether these challenges and others facing Mr. Putin could pose an existential threat to his leadership at some point.
It's certainly plausible. I mean, this is the social compact that Vladimir Putin first struck in effect with the Russian people when he came to power, which is that you, in effect, defer to me and the consolidation of politics and power in the Kremlin, and in exchange, I will provide you a country in which the standard of living is better, in which there's stability, in which you can live your life without worrying about the kind of chaos that Russia saw in the 1990s following the collapse of the Soviet Union. If that changes, if those conditions no longer are the way they have been for most of his rule, that sort of throws that question onto the table again. Now, having said that, Vladimir Putin has an argument to make, and his argument will be that it's the West that has caused this, an enemy, in effect, on the outside, and that will strike up a nationalist argument that he'll make with the Russian people. We'll see whether they buy it.
Now, fighting has increased in Ukraine since the September ceasefire. Do you think President Putin is willing to risk his economy to perhaps rebuild the Soviet Union? And what will it take for him to listen to other countries?
Well, clearly so far he's shown he is willing to take a great deal of economic damage in exchange for his intervention in Ukraine, and he hasn't really backed down. He understood from the beginning that Europe and the United States would have to respond. I think he might have underestimated just how much they've done in terms of sanctions and how much the world more broadly, forgetting sanctions, has reacted to the instability that he has created with Ukraine. But he's shown no interest in backing down on that, and he, I think, is depending on the sort of very traditional Russian willingness to suffer. In effect, suffering is a long history in Russia. He's counting on that to get him through this and maybe perhaps drive a wedge between the United States and various countries in Europe to eventually get them to back down.
Yeah, the us against them thing has worked pretty well. These popularity figures, incredibly, aren't bad. You know, after the end of the Soviet Union, there was, the great hope, and there was a bit of a transition towards Western-style democracy, kind of. Does that even exist anymore, the concept of a democratic Russia?
No, they have the forms of democracy without the reality of democracy. You know, they have elections, they have media, they have, in theory, political parties, most of which is all for show. Democracy was a discredited idea in Russia during the 1990s because of the economic turmoil they went through. A lot of Russians associate the very word democracy with chaos. They don't like the idea of democracy as we see it because they associate it with very bad times. And what Vladimir Putin has said is we have our own form of democracy here in Russia. We don't have to have your version of it. But what he means by that, in effect, is a very top-down kind of rule. You can live your life as long as you don't do anything to challenge the central power.
Now, looking at the OPEC decision, for countries that rely heavily on oil exports, as Russia does, it's going to hurt. What sort of impact do you think it will have on Russia over the next 12 months?
Well, it does hurt. It cuts very deeply into Russia's very economic foundation. You know, roughly half of the national budget in Russia depends on energy sales, and when the price of oil has fallen down as much as it has, as quickly as it has, and with OPEC deciding not to cut production so that it will stay down, That's a big bite into Russia's economic well-being, into its finances, and it's going to be felt across the board. You've already seen in the last few days protests in the streets against health care cuts. You're probably going to see more of that if the oil price remains where it's at, and you'll see Russia's leadership in Vladimir Putin blaming the West, saying it's all part of a conspiracy to hold them down.
You got NATO announcing exercises that they're going to be holding. Russia says they're going to do their own. Do you worry when it comes to eastern Ukraine, the situation there, that one itchy trigger finger could make a real mess of this?
Yeah, I don't think there's any desire on the part of either Russia or NATO to go to war with each other, but you can easily see a scenario in which one thing leads to another, and suddenly you're in a position where either by accident or by happenstance, things get really, really dangerous. These overflights Russia has made in Finland, across different parts of Western Europe, in the seas around NATO countries, have been very dangerous. You had NATO jets scrambling to meet Russian jets. This is a prescription for accidents and bad things to happen. So, it's become a volatile moment. I heard one Russian say recently at a conference that he feels that the United States and Russia are closer to war today than they were at many different times during the Cold War. Again, not intentionally, but because of this sort of escalation and tit-for-tat kind of response.
Yeah, he's an old school guy, Cold War mentality, according to many, and regrets the breakup of the Soviet Union. It's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. Peter Baker, great to see you. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.